BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive. For this collection, Max Hastings has selected interviews with Great War veterans filmed in the 1960s. More programmes on this theme and other BBC4 collections are available on BBC iPlayer.
Well, after advancing several days into Belgium and passing these refugees, many of them with their little dog carts and piled with the pitiful possessions, prams, children, one thing and another, we found ourselves eventually going the same way as the refugees. So therefore we knew very well we were no longer advancing into Belgium. And of course our road got more congested with refugees, and we got mixed up with the infantry, who, in turn, were getting more and more tired. These infantry, unfortunately, began to suffer with feet trouble. I've seen infantry there with their feet bleeding. I've seen infantry with their boots off and puttees wrapped round them. I've seen men sobbing and turning round asking our officers, why the hell can't we fight? Why won't you let us fight? We used to, as artillery, give them a lift whenever we could on the guns, or even on an officer's horse. Our officers have let infantry ride there. But eventually the day came when no longer could we let them ride on our horses because our own horses were getting chafed. Now, in peacetime they had a rest, but here there was no respite whatsoever, no let-up. The Germans were on our tail the whole time. And so, therefore, we had to conserve the energy of the horses as well as the men. So the order was given, all gunners must walk. And wherever possible, a driver was taken off his horse to lead his horse. So therefore, the infantry didn't get their lift. And we mustn't forget, they were carrying somewhere in the region of 100 pound on the back, the infantry, which we did not have. And so therefore, their feet got worse and worse. A lot of it was due to the fact that a number of them were reservists and had been called up just prior to the outbreak of war. And of course, the first thing that happened to them, they were fitted out with kit, including ammos. We called them ammos, but it's the old army word for boots, and they were very heavy. Well, before the war, we were able to break them in, but they didn't get time. They were put straight on a march which lasted for about 150, 160 miles, with only a very, very few rests. And if they got those boots off, they couldn't get them back on again. Consequently, their feet were bleeding, and, of course, they had to either throw boots away or wrap them round with puttees. And that was the cause. The most of their trouble was frustration. Frustration. They just could not fight. They wouldn't care a damn about the pain, about the fatigue, about anything if they'd been allowed to fight. And it was only exceptional cases where perhaps there was a little rearguard action where they were allowed to get into action and have a real fight. And that bucked them up no end. But this went on and went on. And, of course, all the time we were retiring, the Germans were coming on and having all the food and that imaginable from the houses, and we were told then that we must live off the land. We must get everything we can from empty houses, otherwise the Germans would have it. Well, I remember seeing the Munsters once. They got, I think, about 5 cows in front of them, and they tried to drive them along the road in front of them, and I think they were going to kill them at night. That was only my surmise, but those cows knew more than the Munsters. First of all, one would go in a field one side, and one would go in a field the other side. I don't know how many they got away with, but I was very lucky because I was on a telephone cart and I was able to get quite a bit of provisions to put in that telephone cart, share out amongst the others. I remember we went once to a house which we thought was empty, and a pal of mine said, look, he said, there's some lovely rabbits there in those hutches. Let's have some of them. I said, righto, we'll have them. So in we went, and he pulled one out and killed it. I said, how'd you kill them then? Well, he said, just like this. Hold the hind legs and smack them on the back of the neck. Okay, I just completed that, and the door opened and a demoiselle came out. My God, didn't we go through that hedge? Absolutely head first. Then again, we got some chickens at one time, and we thought we'd wrung their necks nicely. We put them in the sack. They went on the telephone cart. We hadn't gone, I suppose, a quarter of a mile. The sack had jumped off the cart. That was them going west. But I think our greatest day came on September the 5th, when we were told that tomorrow we might be able to advance, or we should advance. And then that was the time when you should have seen those infantrymen, not only the artillerymen, but the infantrymen. You should have seen their faces. I mean, they were absolutely as though they were going to a football match. At last, they were going to get what they wanted. They were going to fight the Germans, and that's what they'd come out there for. Oh, we had some Germans fetched in an ambulance once, and they were talking to us in broken English, and one of them said, oh, he said, Belgian, no good shot. French, no good shot. British, he too damn good shot. Now, what these Germans thought, when our boys had opened up, our infantry had opened up, that they were opposing nests of machine guns. But they weren't. All they were opposing was their rifles. And all these boys were firing at 15 rounds a minute, which misled the Germans to think that they got big batteries of machine guns. And I believe the complement of a battalion was 2 machine guns only. That September 1915, that September morning, when we were planning the attack on Loos, it turned out a lovely morning, but we'd been up the trenches, my pal and I, getting the wire ready to lay out behind the infantry. The plan was to take Loos. We were almost in front of Hullock, and our objective was Hullock. And right in front of our trench, the ground sloped upwards to the German strong point, which was rather a terrifying sight from the front line, because going away in front of us, up for a sheer almost 800 yards and an incline all the way right to the German trenches. And that's what the infantrymen had to face. Well, we opened up with a terrific bombardment to try and break through the wire. And then the gas was let loose. And our infantrymen, all clad in these Ku Klux Klan helmets, just with a little thing to put in the mouth, went off. Well, they had this 800 yards with fixed bayonets, and they had to charge. There was no loitering with those things. And what happened was that a lot of them thought that they were suffocating, and they pulled the helmets off. Unfortunately, just at that moment, the wind saw fit to change, not only change, but to start to blow back, and the gas came back on our infantry. And it caused terrible execution, because I saw all the bodies thereafter. But not only the gas on our front caused execution. As I went over some time later, we got to a sap that led straight up into the German trenches, and at the head of that sap there was a German machine gunner handcuffed to his machine gun. Now, down to the side of him there seemed to be thousands and thousands of cartridge cases, and in front of him, all the way up that sap, I saw our dead fellows. He caused terrible execution, but all I saw of him was his head bowed down on the machine gun and split open where one of our lads had probably caught him with the butt end of the rifle. Of course, those lads weren't moved for some days. The dead weren't moved, the wounded were. And for days after, when I was laying that wire out, I had to pass over those bodies, whose faces were turning more and more blue and green. The buttons were blue and green. As a matter of fact, it was a terrible sight, and we had 1 or 2 frosts those evenings, which made things much worse. Well, on the left of us, there was the Hohenzollern redoubt, they called it one of the most strong points of the war at that time, and I know our guards had 2 or 3 attempts to do it without any luck at all. I was told to lay a wire up to the Hullock Crossroads. Well, I went over the first and second line of trenches, and I got right up to where there was some German trenches had been captured, and an officer came down and he said, where are you going? I said, I better lay a wire to the Crossroads, Hullock. He said, you better get off back, he said. We haven't captured it yet, so back we had to go, and I wasn't sorry either. And cut. Yes, you bet. Well, I suppose there's a limit to everything, but what with the mud of the Somme and the mud of Passchendaele, to see men keep on sinking into the slime, dying in the slime, I think it absolutely finished me off, because I knew for 3 months before I was wounded that I was going to get it. I knew jolly well. The only thing was I thought I was going to get killed, and every time I went out to mend a wire, I think I was the biggest coward on God's earth. Of course, there were no times of duty regarding mending telephone wires. Nobody knew when a wire would go, but we knew it had to be mended. The infantrymen's lives depended on these wires working. And it didn't matter whether we'd had sleep or whether we hadn't had sleep. We just had to keep those wires through. And there were many days when, actually, I don't remember them. I don't remember what happened because I was so damn tired. And there was mud everywhere, mud in the trenches, mud in front of the trenches, behind the trenches. Every shell hole was a sea of filthy, oozing mud. And the fatigue in that mud was something terrible. The very fact of having to go 8 and 10 miles round those wires and try and pull your feet out. And as I say, as you pulled one foot out, the other one would sink down. And when you hadn't had sleep for several nights, and when you hadn't had rest, and sometimes hardly a meal, it did get you. And you reached a point where there was no beyond. You just could not go any further, and that's the point I'd reached. It was somewhere near midnight, I think. I'd been out on the wires all day, all night. I hadn't had any sleep, it seemed, for weeks, and no rest. And it was very, very difficult to mend a telephone wire in this mud. You'd find one end, and then you'd try and trudge through the mud to find the other end. And as you got one foot out, the other one would go down. I was tired of seeing infantry sinking back in that morass, never to come out alive again. I was tired of all the carnage, of all the sacrifice that we had there just to gain about 25 yards. And this night, I think I'd reached my lowest ebb. The Germans were sending over quite a barrage, and I crouched down in one of these dirty shell holes. And then I began to think of those poor devils who had been punished for self-inflicted wounds. Some had even been shot, and I began to wonder how I could get out of it. And I sat there and kept thinking, and it's very lonely when you're on your own. And then, in the distance, I heard the rattle of harness. I didn't hear much of the wheels, but I knew there were ammunition wagons coming up. And I thought to myself, well, here's a way out. When they get level with me, I'll ease out and put my leg under the wheel. I should bound to get away, and I can plead it was an accident. Well, I waited, and the sound of the harness got nearer and nearer. Eventually, I saw the leading horses' heads in front of me, and I thought, this is it. And I began to ease my way out, and eventually the first wagon reached me. And you know, I never even had the guts to do that. I found myself wishing to do it, but hadn't got the guts to do it. Well, I went on, I finished my wire, I found the other end and mended it. I was out twice more that night. I was out next day. And the next night, my pal came out with me. He wasn't busy on the other wires. And after the Germans had stopped shelling a little while, we heard one of their big ones coming over. And normally, within reason, you could tell if one was going to land anywhere near or not. If it was, the normal procedure was to throw yourself down and avoid the shell fragments. This one, we knew was going to drop near. My pal shouted and threw himself down. I was too damn tired even to fall down. I stood there. Next, I had a terrific pain in the back and the chest, and I found myself face downwards in the mud. My pal came to me. He tried to lift me up, and I said to him, "Don't touch me, leave me. I've had enough, just leave me." The next thing, I found myself sinking down in the mud. And this time, I didn't worry about the mud. I didn't hate it anymore. It seemed like a protective blanket covering me. And I thought to myself, well, if this is death, it's not so bad. And then I found myself being bumped about. And I realized that I was on a stretcher. And I thought, poor devils, these stretcher bearers. I wouldn't be a stretcher bearer for anything. And then something else happened. I suddenly realized that I wasn't dead. I realized that I was alive. I realized that if these wounds didn't prove fatal, that I should get back to my parents, to my sister, to the girl that I was going to marry, the girl that had sent me a letter every day, practically, from the beginning of the war. Then, the dressing station, morphia, and I must then have had that sleep that I so badly needed, for I didn't recollect any more until I found myself in a bed with white sheets, and I heard the lovely, wonderful voices of our nurses, English, Scotch, and Irish, And I think then I completely broke down. Next, the padre was sitting beside the bedside. He was trying to comfort me. He told me I'd had an operation. And he told me that he had some relatives out there that had been out there right from the beginning. And by God's grace, they hadn't had a scratch. He said, they've been lucky, haven't they? I thought to myself, lucky. Poor devils.